They tried to bury him, headlines screamed accusations. Social media burned with outrage. Night after night, networks played the same grainy footage. In the court of public opinion, Sean Diddy Combs was already guilty. But in the real courtroom, the one with laws, rules, and a jury of 12, the prosecution had one job: prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And they didn't. What they built was a house of mirrors, emotional testimony, suggestive timelines, innuendo wrapped in trauma. But in a federal court of law, emotion isn't enough. Vibes aren't evidence. Speculation isn't proof. This isn't about defending every decision Combs has made. This is about what was alleged and what wasn't proven. This is the story of how the government's case began to fall apart, of how key charges were dropped, and how in the end, the defense delivered a closing argument that just might bring Sean Combs home. From the very beginning, federal prosecutors painted the image of a man running a criminal empire. Sex trafficking, racketeering, coercion, a lifestyle built on power and fear, they said. But the trial didn't go the way they hoped. The prosecution brought in 34 witnesses over 7 weeks. They flooded the courtroom with stories, some heartbreaking, some disturbing, many of them difficult to verify. Witnesses testified to lavish parties, alleged abuse, drug use, and a lifestyle full of excess. Cassie Ventura, the ex-girlfriend whose civil lawsuit kicked off the storm, was presented as a key narrative thread. Other witnesses, including an anonymous accuser named Jane, were used to show a pattern of control and manipulation. But patterns don't equal proof. And throughout the trial, what became more and more apparent was this: the prosecution could not tie Combs to the criminal enterprise they claimed he ran. They couldn't connect the dots between disturbing behavior and the federal charges on the table, especially the most serious ones: racketeering and sex trafficking. No criminal enterprise was mapped. No financial flowchart showing he profited from trafficking. No messages, recordings, or third-party communications establishing coercion for commercial sex acts. What they had was behavior, some of it ugly, but not organized crime. That's the difference between a man with power and problems and a man running a criminal racket. Let's break it down. To convict Sean Combs of racketeering, prosecutors had to prove a pattern of racketeering activity tied to a criminal enterprise. That means more than just bad behavior, it means a system, a network, a chain of command. But time and again, the prosecution failed to deliver this. They leaned on shock value, graphic testimony, tales of wild parties, and intimate details from broken relationships. But none of it pointed to trafficking with force, fraud, or coercion. None of it proved that Combs orchestrated a criminal operation for profit. What it revealed was a man who lived a messy, sometimes morally questionable lifestyle, but not a trafficker, not a racketeer. That distinction is everything. This is why federal charges are so hard to win. You need substance, not just suggestion. Even the most dramatic moment of the trial, the 2016 hotel surveillance footage allegedly showing Combs attacking Cassie, didn't confirm the elements needed for federal charges. That video was shocking. But it wasn't proof of sex trafficking. It wasn't proof of a criminal enterprise. It was proof of domestic violence. Maybe, but that wasn't the charge on trial. This is what the defense zeroed in on: the mismatch between accusation and evidence. And the jury knows it. Then came the surprise development. Some of the most serious charges were dropped before the trial even began. Early in the legal proceedings, the prosecution quietly dismissed several counts that simply couldn't hold up under scrutiny. Charges tied to alleged incidents from the early 2000s were withdrawn when timelines didn't add up. Witnesses changed stories, and potential evidence didn't pass the reliability test. Why does this matter? Because it shows that from the beginning the case was overcharged. The government tried to paint Sean Combs as a monster, then quietly peeled back the layers when the facts didn't line up. The trial started smaller than the headlines had promised, and jurors noticed that. The defense made sure they did. They reminded the jury that if prosecutors really had the evidence, those charges would still be standing. But they're not. They fell apart, and maybe the rest will too. Then came the moment that could swing it all. Closing arguments. The prosecution asked the jury to believe that everything from Combs' relationships to his businesses to his private parties was part of a calculated criminal network, but the defense didn't flinch. In their closing argument, Combs' attorneys did something bold. They acknowledged the uncomfortable parts of his past. They didn't sugarcoat it. They said in plain terms, maybe Sean Combs has been a domestic abuser. That is not what he's on trial for. Then they drew a line in the sand. Bad behavior isn't always criminal behavior, and not all immoral actions rise to the level of federal crime. This was their message to the jury. Don't let the media trial influence your verdict. Look at what was actually proven. They argued that the prosecution was trying to criminalize a swinger's lifestyle, to make consensual adult relationships look like coercion, that the government blurred the line between questionable morals and criminal enterprise, that none of the testimony connected Combs to the specific federal definitions of racketeering or trafficking, and most importantly, they reminded the jury of their legal duty. If there is any reasonable doubt in your mind, you must find Mr. Combs not guilty. The defense didn't say Sean Combs is a perfect man. They said he's not a criminal under the law. That strategy, it may have worked. When the defense rested, the next phase became just as critical. Jury instructions. This isn't TV. This isn't social media. In real courtrooms, jurors don't decide based on emotion or gut instinct. They decide based on law, and the judge made that clear. The jurors were instructed to evaluate the evidence presented within the narrow and specific definitions of each charge. And this is where the weight shifted, possibly for good. Because what's required to convict someone of sex trafficking and racketeering, it's not just a bad relationship. It's not just a toxic pattern. It's not even violence. It's a criminal operation, organized and continuous, done for profit, and executed through coercion, force, or fraud. Jurors were reminded of the standard, beyond a reasonable doubt. It's the highest bar in our justice system, and it exists for a reason. The burden isn't on the defense to prove Sean Combs is innocent. It's on the government to prove he's guilty, and not just probably guilty, not just likely, but undeniably. And that, the defense argued, was something the prosecution had never done. They asked the jury to take off the tabloid glasses and put on the lens of the law. They said the headlines may be ugly, the rumors may be loud, but rumors don't convict people, facts do. And when those instructions were read, the jury got their final reminder: reasonable doubt equals acquittal. From day one, this case was fought in two arenas: the courtroom and the media. Out there in the world of clickbait, breaking news, and viral videos, Combs was painted as the villain. Every past mistake, every grainy video clip, every settlement from years ago was brought to the forefront. But in here, inside that courtroom, only admissible evidence mattered. The jury never saw most of what the public saw. They didn't scroll the Instagram posts. They didn't hear the podcast debates. They didn't get the biased YouTube recaps. What they got was testimony under oath, exhibits that passed legal standards, and arguments bound by federal law. That difference, it's everything, because the defense masterfully exposed it. They pointed out how the media had turned Sean Combs into a symbol, but in court the government couldn't connect the symbol to the crime. They said the government is trying to prosecute a persona, not a person. That's not justice, that's theater. And the jurors, sitting quietly for 7 long weeks, finally saw what the outside world never slowed down to examine: that the louder the noise, the weaker the case began to look. There's a question people asked: why didn't Sean Combs take the stand? The answer is strategic and telling. In American courts, defendants are never required to testify, and good defense lawyers know when not to risk it, because putting a client on the stand opens the door to every contradiction, every misstep, every out-of-context quote from years ago. Instead, the defense made a calculated decision: let the prosecution's case collapse under its own weight. They didn't call a single witness, because they didn't need to. By the end of the prosecution's case, the holes were already there. Wrong concrete financial trail proving trafficking. No third-party corroboration of coercion. No enterprise structure, no criminal network. If the government can't prove its own case, it's not the defense's job to fill in the blanks. That silence, it wasn't weakness. It was power. It was restraint. It was a signal to the jury that the facts as presented weren't enough to convict. And it worked. On the same day the closing arguments were delivered, a new storm hit the news. A fresh lawsuit filed in Los Angeles, accusing Sean Combs and his son Justin of a 2017 gang rape. The headlines exploded. Twitter, YouTube, and mainstream media ran wild. But inside that Manhattan courtroom, none of that mattered. The judge issued strict instructions: do not let outside accusations affect your verdict. This jury is here to decide one case, not all cases, one set of charges, one set of evidence. And the defense jumped on the timing of the LA lawsuit. They said, you think it's coincidence this new filing came on the very day of closing arguments? They pointed to a larger narrative, one of civil attorneys and opportunists seizing the moment for attention, settlement pressure, or media spin. They urged the jury, stay focused. Don't be distracted by what wasn't proven here. And legally they're right. Civil cases don't meet the criminal standard. They don't have to. But this trial does. And on the evidence presented in this courtroom, reasonable doubt flooded the room. As the jury began deliberations, tension filled the room. 12 strangers, 12 sets of eyes, each one tasked with putting aside their personal bias, their fear of public backlash, their assumptions about celebrity or fame. Their job: weigh the evidence, stick to the law, and ask, did the government prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt? The likely answer? No. Not on trafficking, not on racketeering, not on the criminal enterprise they claimed he led. Even those open to the idea that Combs had toxic relationships, or even committed acts of domestic violence, would be forced to admit that's not what he was charged with. And if the case doesn't meet the burden, then the result is clear. Sean Combs will walk free, not because he's perfect, but because the system demands proof, and the prosecution simply didn't deliver it. He's been through the storm, watched the world turn on him, felt the weight of a billion eyes judging, speculating, deciding guilt before evidence. But through it all, Sean Combs stood trial. He faced the system, and now as the jury prepares to deliver its verdict, there's one reality rising above the noise: he will be acquitted. Not
not because he's untouchable, but because the case against him wasn't airtight. Because in this country we don't convict people based on rumors. We don't send them away because of how we feel. We convict based on what's proven. And if that proof isn't there, we let them go. This trial will be remembered not for what it revealed, but for what it failed to prove. And when the dust settles, Sean Combs will walk out of that courtroom not as a symbol of scandal, but as a man who stood his ground and won. Coming home, head held high. The world may never see him the same again. But the law spoke loud and clear. Not guilty.